Well, my glamorous assistant now will step in and help me with the slides. I've got to go Specsavers. Anyway, the story as far as Henry Coombe-Tennant, so it starts at Neath, which is where I live at the moment. And this is Caddiston Lodge, where Henry was born in 1913. Quite an impressive residence. In 1911, there were 6 servants working at the house. And the Coombe-Tennants were sort of, I would say, an upper middle class family. They weren't landed gentry, but they did run a family estate at Neath. And the origin of the wealth of the Coombe-Tennant family, I think, people trying to get in, comes from the Tennant Canal, which was built in the 19th century by a chap called George Tennant. And I think that produced an income for the family throughout the 19th and indeed the 20th centuries. And indeed, even in the 21st century, the family was still receiving income from the canal by selling the water to industry for cooling purposes and so on. The canal is now in a bit of doubt because some of the industries have moved away and closed down. And there's a question mark over the future of the canal. So the next slide, see. And Henry's parents, Charles Coombe-Tennant, he was a barrister by profession. And in 1895, he married Winifred Pierce Sericold, an unusual name, a lady who was 20 years his junior. And they settled into the family home at Caddiston Lodge near Neath. Next slide as well. Now, Charles had been a barrister, as they say, and he took an active interest in running the Tennant Canal. I would say, without any sort of hint of criticism, Winifred at the time was what we would call perhaps a lady of leisure. The family income kept her sort of quite contented financially, and she involved herself in lots of social activities around the Neath area. And in fact, she was a justice of the peace, a prison visitor, a suffragist who spoke on votes for women at various public events. She was active in the Eisteddfod, the National Festival of Wales, and she became the mistress of the robes. She stood for Parliament in 1922 as a Liberal candidate, didn't win the election, but Lloyd George thought quite a lot of her. And indeed, she was the first female delegate from Britain to attend the League of Nations in 1922. So a well-to-do lady and a very busy lady who kept herself active. Now, the children of the marriage of Winifred and Charles, Christopher was born in 1897, and his daughter, his sister followed in 1907, named Daphne. Both of these children did live to see adulthood. Daphne died in 1908, aged only 18 months, and Christopher was killed in action in the First World War while serving with the Welsh Guards. The third child of the marriage was Alexander, and he was born in 1909, the year after the death of Daphne. Now, Henry Coombe-Tennant was the fourth and final child of the family. And to look at Henry's life, really, we need to start off with Winifred Coombe-Tennant and her interest in psychic affairs. Now, back then, when Daphne, her daughter, died in 1908, Winifred wanted to satisfy herself that Daphne's spirit, in fact, had survived death. And she contacted a psychic medium to try and make contact with the spirit of Daphne. Not an uncommon practice back then. And in fact, she had some advantages because one of her family members by marriage was a chap called Frederick Myers, and he had been a former president of the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR.
Oh, somebody trapped in the pit.
Nothing to do with the PowerPoint. Give me a second. So when she tried to make contact with Daphne, and Winifred wasn't very happy with the results. She thought they were inconclusive. And in fact, she was surprised to find that with a bit of help and assistance from members of the Society for Psychical Research, which I will call SPR, because it's easier, with some help from SPR members, in fact, she thought she could contact Daphne's spirit herself by what was called automatic writing, where she would engage with the spirit world contact, and the spirit would guide the hand in writing messages and so on. Again, we may find this hard to believe or unacceptable, but that's the way that Winifred saw it, and she was very sincere in her beliefs. So she believed that she did make contact with Daphne's spirit, and indeed, within a week of Christopher's death on the Western Front, she believed she had got in touch with him as well. And he was fine in a new place, in a new form, and in the circumstances quite happy. As I say, very unusual beliefs, but not that uncommon at the time. Now, the fourth child, as I say, was Henry, and the circumstances of his birth, as you may well know, are a little bit unusual. He was born in 1913. The birth was difficult. Initially, he was born a Tennant, but by deed poll, he added Coombe with a hyphen to make it Coombe-Tennant with a hyphen when he was about 16. And this matched his father. His father was Charles Coombe-Tennant and was commonly known as a Coombe-Tennant. So it sort of regularized that arrangement. Now, Henry's birth was a planned birth, but not a planned birth in the way we think of it today. The plan was that Winifred, assisted by her spirit world contacts, and again, we've got to think about this very carefully, but she believed her spirit world contacts would help guide Henry to become the new Messiah, bringing peace and calm to a troubled world. Sounds incredibly far-fetched, but again, the world history is littered with people who either thought they were the Messiah or thought by others to be the Messiah, and we make of that what we will. Now, how was the plan to be achieved? How could Winifred have this fourth child, Henry, and how could he become the new Messiah? Slightly. When she was doing her psychic events, if you like, her mediumship, she became involved with Gerald Balfour, the brother of Arthur, sometime Prime Minister. Gerald himself was actually keenly interested in psychic research. He was a gentleman of leisure, plenty of money, and he spent a lot of time looking into psychic affairs. He met with Winifred because he knew of her work. She worked as a medium secretly. She was known as Mrs. Willett to avoid any sort of controversy or embarrassment, but he knew of her through his contacts with the SPR. They sort of got together, and eventually he sort of simply evolved, if you like, into the role of becoming Henry's biological father. Luckily, Winifred and Gerald became infatuated with each other. They were both married to other people, of course, but they became infatuated, and they had a secret relationship that lasted several years. Charles, her husband, was 20 years older than Winifred. It wasn't a marriage devoid of love in any way at all. It was a very happy marriage. But Winifred really believed that with Gerald, she could achieve this sort of unique mission, if you like, of producing a new Messiah. And that heavily influenced her outlook on matters. Now, in July 1912, Gerald Balfour visited Carrington Lodge, yet again, sort of thing, and he stayed for a week. And by the end of the month, Winifred realized she was pregnant. Charles would have been in the house probably, but he was very hard of hearing, probably just as well. So it's accepted today, I think, that Gerald, in fact, was the biological father of Henry. And there's no doubt, as I say, that at the time, Winifred especially was infatuated with Gerald. They did fall out a few years after Henry's birth. Henry was born in 1913. In 1917, Christopher was killed in action on the Western Front. Winifred took steps to ensure that Christopher would never be forgotten. I think they erected about 7 memorials in France, in Australia, one of the colleges in England. Lots of little memorials to make sure that Christopher wouldn't be forgotten. In 1917, as I say, one of the things she did to memorialize Christopher was she had a book produced giving an account of his fairly short life, really. And she asked Gerald Balfour to write the foreword. Now, Gerald wrote a very nice foreword, but in Winifred's views, it didn't quite emphasize how sort of unique and special Christopher had been. And they actually fell out over that. Winifred took a bit of umbrage at this. She thought he wasn't enough, fulsome enough tribute, if you like. And the relationship was never quite the same. Although they did remain friends until Gerald died in 1945. So, can I have the next slide, then, please? So this is one of the earliest photos I've seen of Henry with his special hat on. And as I say, he added the Coombe to his name when he was around 16 years of age by deed poll. Choosing names for Henry, they went for Augustus Henry Coombe-Tennant. As I say, no Coombe at that time. Augustus harking back, we think, to a great emperor, and Winifred had this great vision for Henry of becoming a new Messiah. Henry was in tribute to Henry Sidgwick, who was a member of the SPR, who had died. Serical was a maiden name, and Tennant, of course, was Charles's family name. On an everyday basis, they called Henry Henry. His mother, in fact, typically referred to him as the wise one. And she really believes that she saw sort of special promise, special ability in this youngster that she had such great hopes for. So it's not uncommon to see Henry as a battle-hardened soldier 40 years later, perhaps writing to his mother as W.O. or Wise One. So that continued until Winifred's death, really. On the next one. And here we've got a photo of Henry on the right and his brother, older brother Alexander, on the left. And we've got Charles Coombe-Tennant here today, actually, a member of the family. And Charles is Henry's oldest nephew. So, as I say, after giving birth, Winifred, I think, was looking for signs that Henry was special, and indeed was actually finding signs that showed that perhaps he was a bit of a special child. He was precocious. At the age of 5, recorded in the family archives. Winifred kept a very extensive family archive. She felt it was very important. Kept lots of letters back and forth between her children, and even had sort of the governesses and the nursemaids write down things that her children had done or said for future reference, and they were typed up and stored away. And some of these tell us that at the age of 5, he told his governess that what he was telling her was expressed in the King's English, and he couldn't help it if she failed to understand it. He told his father that one statement that Charles had made was colloquial English, and he wouldn't say, he wouldn't write it like that. So he was quite a talented lad. Next slide. Here he is with his older brother Christopher. As I say, Christopher was killed in action in 1917. Now, like many families at that time, at the age of 9, dear old Henry was packed off to West Downs School near Winchester. And the principal there soon wrote to tell Winifred, and I quote, "He has been continually disobedient and troublesome in the dormitory and seems to have no conception of what is meant by school discipline. He is hardly ever in bed in time. He refuses to obey the senior boys. He rags about in the dormitory when he should be undressing. He talks after lights out, and he gets up late at night and walks about to amuse himself." So he wasn't exactly an ideal pupil. Even as the principal wrote that letter, had it typed up, he added a handwritten postscript to say that even while this was being typed, he's been naughty once again. So he certainly wasn't the ideal pupil. While at West Downs Prep School, he did show some talents, especially in playing the piano, something that he practiced throughout his life. His time at the school came to an abrupt end when Winifred saw what she thought was the school's indifference about Henry's health. She always worried about the children's health, and the school had been a bit sort of tardy in dealing with one bout of childhood sickness. And she also found that one of the school nurses apparently had chased 2 other boys with a toasting fork, which she didn't think was ideal sort of school discipline. So she resolved to remove Henry from the West Downs School. On the next slide, please, Steve. And this is a photo of the family, a happy family, as I say, a lot of love in the family. Winifred, very, very doting on all their children. We've got a very serious looking Charles on the right, as I say, 20 years older than Winifred and 60 years older than Henry. Alexander standing, Winifred in the middle, and Henry on the right-hand side, hugging his mother. So at the age of 10, Henry was sent off now to Pinewood School as a replacement for the West Downs School. This was near Farnborough. He settled in well, apparently, and his piano playing was proving to be almost obsessive. And in fact, his mother drew up a little agreement that Henry had to sign, saying that he would in fact limit his piano practice to certain times of the day and so on, because he was spending far too much time on the piano. On other things, he wasn't quite so good. He was okay in classics, above average in French, English and punctuation, but his mathematics was described as being fragmentary. History was fair. Geography was a disaster, apparently. And in sport, he was always indifferent in sport throughout his life, but his fielding in cricket was found to be useful. At the age of 12, he sent his mother a bit of a bombshell letter from the school, from Pinewood, saying that he was going to found his own religion. He was forming a religion that would be based on the Holy Trinity plus Buddha. And he saw this as being his future life's work. He would go to China as a man and convert the Chinese people to the new religion that he was setting up. After much correspondence between Henry, his mother, and the school principal, he agreed to sort of move back onto his more normal studies, and he would leave his missionary duties in China until later in life. In fact, he never really lost his interest in China, and when at Eton, he wrote home to say that he had self-taught himself some Chinese. He was giving private lessons to a pupil in Chinese, and I think Gerald Balfour took him to be assessed by somebody at the School of Oriental and Asiatic Studies, and they were told there that his Chinese writing, for one so young, was quite exceptional. He was a very talented man. Also at the age of 12, in 1925, because of his piano playing expertise, he was taken before Sir Hugh Allen, never heard of him, but at the time he was the unofficial head of the music profession in Great Britain. He was a professor of music at one of the big colleges. And he had Henry perform musical exercises over 35 minutes and said that he was very, very impressed by his talent and he thought he should be encouraged. Henry did later toy with the idea of becoming a professional pianist, but other things got in the way and it never happened. Also at the school, he wrote a poem that his principal headmaster sent off to two literary experts, and they came back and said that it contained a touch of real genius. And again, his work there should be encouraged. So he was a talented young lad. Next one, please, Steve. Sorry, I thought we missed a slide there, but we haven't. I said the family were well connected. This is Caddiston Lodge, or the Gardens, in 1923, and Winifred was a Liberal party supporter. And as you can see, she's pictured there. David Lloyd George is pictured there in the centre. He's no longer Prime Minister. He finished that job, sort of thing. Alexander on the left, and a young Henry on the right. So very, very well connected. In 1926, Henry went off to Eton College, and again, he applied himself to subjects that he liked, music, piano playing, and so on, but he wasn't so attentive in other areas. And here he is at Eton, and later in life, Lady Jean Balfour, one of the Balfours, did say that many people regarded him as being the most beautiful human being they'd have ever seen. And again, Winifred would have liked this idea because, again, she thought he was very special. So he's not a bad-looking chap, is he? However, at Eton, Henry didn't sort of enjoy his time there, really. And he actually asked his mother and Gerald Balfour, who was his guardian, could he actually discontinue his studies? That request was refused, however, and he had to plod on, unhappy with his lot. Over time, his attitude there did improve a little, but it's fair to say, I think, that he was glad to get away from there when he moved on to Cambridge. Next slide. In 1928, Henry's father, Charles Coombe-Tennant, died, and control of the family estate passed to his older brother Alexander, who was Charles's father. And in the early 1930s, Winifred, sitting almost alone, if you like, in Caddiston Lodge in Neath, a large, sort of expansive house, thought that perhaps her future might lie elsewhere. Alexander was forging a successful career in the City of London. Henry was at university and would probably be moving away from Neath to work and so on. So the family essentially put Caddiston Lodge up for sale, and Winifred moved to London. This is Henry at Eton, photograph on the left and a painting by Evan Walters on the right. Winifred was a great patron of the arts in Wales, supported numerous Welsh artists, and one of them was Evan Walters. He's out of fashion a bit now, but he's still sort of well known. And he produced a very similar portrait, if you like, to Henry, as we got the image there. The Western Mail, not being a Liberal newspaper, looked at this painting and commented that if that's Eton, we're going to send our boys elsewhere, because I think they didn't like Winifred's politics and had a little go at her son. So there we are, very nice. And in 1929, as sort of Charles Coombe-Tennant's financial affairs were unwound after his death, in the records I've seen, Henry could expect an income when he reached maturity of around £3,500 a year, which is not a bad sum in 1928. His capital assets at that time were assessed at around £50,000 a year. Now, £50,000 a year back then, compared to today, on one of these conversion calculators, is about 3 million quid. So he certainly wasn't a poor young man. But off he went after Eton up to Cambridge. Next one, please. At Cambridge, he wasn't sure what degree to do. He hadn't done hard a bit, but he ended up doing the moral sciences course, which is essentially philosophy. And he did a few years studying that. While he was there, he went off on a public schoolboys tour of Canada, Eton, all these Harrow and so on, where they visited Canada, went around the place and so on, and tried to forge links with the empire, if you like, really, as young men. He also went to Canada again, and he's pictured here. He was assistant secretary to a meeting of the Institute of Pacific Relations. I think that body is still around. But he was an assistant secretary. He helped with the transport arrangements, the accommodation arrangements, and so on. And he's pictured in the front row there. I've blown it up a little bit over there. So he's a busy young man, anyway. Also in 1933, given his interest in China, he had a chance to go off to China with a retired diplomat, and they spent some time going around China, interviewing political leaders there, military leaders. They went to Japan as well and did the same sort of thing. And this was a trip that was of great interest to Henry. But at the end of the trip, he did decide that in his future, he would not be doing missionary work in China, which is not surprising, probably. Still at Cambridge in 1934, he completed a stint as an organizer at an unemployed workmen's camp. And these were quite common back then. The feeling was, by the powers that be, if you like, the authorities, men who had been faced with prolonged periods of unemployment due to the depression had become sort of softened. And before they could be sort of sent into proper training camps, they needed to be toughened up. And he was sent to a training camp in the north of England, which was packed full of unemployed men, and basically he sort of tried to encourage them into more productive sort of routines and so on, and he quite enjoyed the experience. He was quite struck by the level, if you like, of poverty and disillusionment amongst these men who had been unemployed for so long. The government weren't doing much for them, unemployment benefits weren't really good, and he thought it was a massive waste of talent, and it had a big impact on him. He did, in fact, consider a career in politics to see whether he could sort of make things better for these sort of men. But again, that didn't actually happen. Next slide, please. And again, during the 30s, he did spend several skiing trips in the Alps, more or less every year, Christmas or thereabouts. He'd go off to the Alps and ski about a bit, and he's pictured there with one of his alpine guides. At Cambridge, doing his philosophy degree, he came under the influence of Ludwig Wittgenstein, a famous philosopher. John Maynard Keynes had invited Wittgenstein to Cambridge, and John Maynard Keynes referred to him simply as God because he thought he was such an incredible intellectual. Henry wasn't taught specifically by him; he was taught by a chap called Charlie Broad, but he was certainly influenced by Wittgenstein, and he thought he was the only real genius that the 20th century had produced. Looking at Henry's correspondence over many years, as I went through the archives, he was obviously a very caring man, a very kind man, but he wasn't averse to expressing his thoughts to his mother in private letters in a pithy manner. Next one, please. This is J.J. Thomson, who won the Nobel Prize for something or other in science of some sort in 1905 or thereabouts. And he was at Cambridge when Henry was there. And Henry actually struck up a friendship with him, and he admired Thomson's brain. He was a very, very intelligent chap, of course. But in letters home, Henry was quite sort of precise about what he said. And he said on Mr. Thomson, he was there shuffling about like an old walrus. On Thomson's daughter, Joan, like a dying swan, wrapped herself around me and talked a lot of nonsense. And on Lady Thomson, he described her conversation as being like a constantly dripping or constantly running tap. So he wasn't averse to putting down his thoughts on paper to his mother, probably never thinking that anybody would ever see these letters again. But he did admire Thomson, as I say. And Henry got a double first in his philosophy degree, so he did very well there. Thought about his options, should I teach at Eton? Should I teach at Cambridge? And then he went somewhere else. He joined the Welsh Guards. He's pictured here behind his commanding officer, Alexander Sammy Stanier. A spur of the moment decision. He later told his mother he had made the decision while he was tipsy. I don't know what happened there, but he ended up in the Welsh Guards, the same battalion that Christopher, his older brother, had died with in 1917. I think he was getting bored with academic life and so on, and he wanted to change. And as I say, at one point he thought of becoming a parliamentary candidate. He thought of quitting the army and taking up farming. He didn't settle for long in the army, really, although he eventually stuck it for 30 years. On the next slide. Here he is in 1939. And of course, war broke out in 39. Nothing much happened. We had the phony war for a while. And on the 13th of May, sorry, on the 10th of May, when the Germans invaded Holland and Belgium and so on, Henry and his Welsh Guards comrades were literally on the train home for about to leave. So as they were leaving for leave, the Germans invaded. So they were all recalled. Welsh Guards, Irish Guards, some came back, some didn't. The orders didn't reach them and so on. And what happened was a composite battalion of about 2/3 Welsh Guards and 2/3 Irish Guards and 1/3 Welsh Guards were sent across to the Hook of Holland on the 13th of May to try and stabilize, if you like, a part of the Dutch front. It was hopeless. They did manage to keep a road open, and Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands got through on this road with her government, and they were taken back to Britain by destroyer. So they did have some use while they were out there. But once the Queen had gone, Henry and his comrades were brought back to Britain. Next slide, please. They made it back to Britain by ship. They were attacked on the way by German aircraft, but luckily suffered minor casualties. And before they'd had a chance really to clean the kit and their uniforms, they were sent back out to Boulogne. And the idea was that the Germans had reached the coast. If Henry and his comrades could hold Boulogne, it could stop the Germans advancing up the coast and enveloping Dunkirk and so on. So it was very much a rearguard action. And they went ashore at Boulogne on the 22nd of May. Here he is in his Welsh Guards uniform. As I say, not very happy in the army in the 30s, but he stuck at it eventually into the 50s. So couldn't have been all bad. Boulogne was in chaos. Allied soldiers were everywhere, retreating in a bad condition. French civilians and so on were there. French troops and so on, they were there. And it was a bit of a disaster area, really. And the Germans were constantly pushing the Welsh Guardsmen and their Irish Guards comrades back into the middle of Boulogne. Henry and 40 of his comrades took shelter in 2 bombed out houses in Boulogne. And I don't know why what their plan was to stay there until dark over a couple of nights and then head south. If they could head south and get through the German lines, the southern part of France was still not under German control. So if they could get through the German lines, they could perhaps reach safety. So why they did this, I've got no idea. But when a German cyclist cycled past the house, somebody shot him. The Germans came down the road with tanks, fired a few shells into the houses. The soldiers retreated to the basement, and there was no chance of escape. The Germans were about to throw hand grenades down. So Henry's commanding officer took the decision to surrender. And Henry became a prisoner of war on the 25th of May, 1940. He was kept for a while at a place called Laufen, prisoner of war camp, and he ended up at Warburg in Westphalia in Germany. And it's noted in the camp records, if you like, that he entertained his fellow prisoners by playing classical, popular and jazz melodies on the piano for hours on end without repetition. And he also lectured on philosophy. It was an officers' camp. There were a few non-officers there, but they were used as back then, really, helping the officers. So he was at Warburg in 1940. Plans were afoot at Warburg fairly soon on to try and, usual thing, dig a tunnel and try and escape and so on. Tunnels didn't work out very well. Some of them collapsed, some of them filled with water, some of them were discovered. A very unhappy time, really. But purely by chance, one of the prisoners, who was an electrical engineer, noticed that it might be possible to fuse the camp lights from a workshop within the prisoner of war camp. Without the Germans realizing really that this had been a deliberate act. So they tried this on a test basis. They actually cut the power for 5 minutes. The Germans just thought it was an electrical fault, fixed it and carried on as normal. But this now meant that the escape committee at the camp could trigger the lights going out whenever they wanted to. And the idea was that rather than go under the wire, in a dodgy tunnel, they would go over the wire. Next slide. And what they did was they made a number of ladders out of wood they nicked off the Germans when they were looking. So Warburg had 2 fences. There was an inner fence, sort of 3-4 foot gap, and an outer fence. And what they thought was, well, if you get the ladder up to the outside fence, or the inside fence rather, put a duckboard across to the outer fence, you've got the ladder, run across, jump down, and you're free under cover of darkness. And they started off planning a 250-man escape. Then they thought that might be a bit ambitious, and they cut it down to 30. 10 teams of 3 in the main, and Henry was in a 3-man team. And on the 30th of August, 1942, the escape was planned to take place, and at the appropriate time, the electrical engineers actually cut the power. The lights went out. 10 teams burst out of various huts made from the wire with numerous ladders and duckboards, and every man carrying a rucksack with 12 pounds of provisions. And they were carrying things like chocolate, cheese, porridge, raisins, biscuits, meat tablets, wherever they are, milk powder, blackened faces to hide in the dark, and so on. And they actually made the escape dressed in their army uniforms, which sounds a bit odd, but the psychological thought was, is that if we're in uniform, we're not going to be sort of sauntering around the occupied countries in the daytime and being spotted. We will only move, in the dark, and in the daytime we will lay up and hide up until we can leave under cover of darkness. So they actually escaped in their army uniforms, and they would travel by night. And on the 3rd of August 1942, it all went to plan. 30 men got over the wire. 27 of them were recaptured within a couple of weeks, but Henry and his 2 comrades were the only ones to get back to Britain. And what they did, as I say, they lay hidden during the days, and they moved off at night. They had a homemade compass. They had some maps that the British intelligence, if you like, had smuggled into the camp in games boxes and God knows what, So they had these things with them, and they travelled by night for a couple of weeks, heading for the Dutch frontier. After 2 weeks, though, on the run, this is in September 1942, they were hungry, they were wet, and they were pretty well exhausted. They were spotted by a Dutch child on the 15th of September 1942. He told a farmer, and the farmer came along at dusk time and escorted them up to his hayloft. And this is a photo taken while they were on the run. We've got Henry in the centre. Albert Arkwright is on the right, and this chap is called Rupert Fuller. A three-man escape team. And as I say, of the 30 men who got over the wire, these are the only 3 to get back to Britain. So the farmer arranged for the local escape line resistance people, if you like, to come to the farm and have a chat with these chaps to make sure they weren't, sort of Nazi infiltrators or German agents and so on. And once they were satisfied they were genuine escapees, they were given civilian clothes, they were given false identity papers and so on. And they were escorted then across Holland and Belgium and into France by members of the Comet Line, as it was called, the Comet Escape Line. There was one hair-raising moment. To be fair, there were probably several hair-raising moments because they were spotted several times, even before this stage, by German children and this sort of thing. But nothing came of it, and once or twice they were spotted in the darkness and I think mistaken for forced labourers and ignored by the Germans, but they were lucky to get away with that. But in the hands of one of these escape lines now, they were being escorted by train in their civilian uniforms with their false papers to the town of Lille, the next stage on their journey. And on the train, a German official came down the train asking questions and so on, now in French. Now Henry spoke very good French. Charles's father, Alexander, as well, spoke very good French. Arkwright had passable French, he could manage, schoolboy French sort of thing. Fuller had no French. Inevitably, the German chose Fuller to ask questions on. Fuller sort of was able to parrot his name, his address, his wife's name, this sort of thing, but little else. So when the German was asking him, what are you doing, what's your business, where are you going, and so on, he was flummoxed. And the German indicated once the train stopped at the next station, the train would be delayed while the Germans interrogated Fuller to see exactly what was going on. And of course, the worry was for the other people in different parts of the train carriage, if Fuller sort of cracked or was revealed as an escapee, the Germans might come back and question people like Henry or Arkwright in a bit more detail, and indeed might look at their papers a bit more closely and see they were forgeries. Fuller, as I say, no real French to speak of. He adopted what he thought was a simple but a desperate strategy. he would try not to answer any questions at all. So when they got him into one of the station rooms and started firing questions at him, he mumbled in broken French. He walked around the room ignoring his captors or his interrogators. He looked at the railway posters and sort of looked in great detail. He examined the insignia on the Germans' uniforms and so on. And in the end, they concluded he was simply feeble-minded. And they thought, that he was the village idiot, basically. So they said, okay, fine, have a cigarette, use your papers, get back on the train, and off you go. So he got away with it. He got back on the train, he wound down the window, very theatrically waved his handkerchief, apparently, at these two Germans. And he later told Henry and Arkwright he did that to make sure the Germans weren't sort of getting on the train further back to keep an eye on him. But they weren't, they'd had enough of him. They thought he was innocent and they let him go. Next slide. And the route they took, as you see, Warburg is over here. No, there should be a P on that. It's in the book, it's Camp. But Warburg is here, right in the heart of Germany. And they go up to Camp, they go into Utrecht, Liège, and so on. Here's Lille, down to Paris. A lot of this then by train with the escape lines, down to Bordeaux and so on. And they reach a town called Saint-Jean-de-Luz on the border with Spain. And they cross there. We'll come to that now shortly. It's a journey of about 1,000 miles, actually, so it's quite a trek, you know. But as I say, they were assisted by pretty brave escape line people along the way. And once they got to Saint-Jean-de-Luz down here, they were escorted on foot over the Pyrenees by some guides. Got to Spain. British Embassy were told they were there, didn't pick them up, taken to Madrid, and then eventually back to Britain again with false papers. Back in Britain, Henry and Arkwright and Fuller all received military crosses for their bravery as escapees. So Henry was now an experienced soldier, if a bit disillusioned after his unhappy experiences. His French was pretty good. He had all the military skills, and he thought that he would join the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, this organization that Churchill said would set Europe ablaze by fighting behind enemy lines. So he spent a little bit of time, I think, in Baker Street in London with planning for SOE operations, but he found that a bit boring. He often got bored with things. And instead, he volunteered for an active role. And in doing so, he accepted high risk of capture, torture, death, and so on. Hitler, in fact, had decreed any Allied special agents or commandos captured in the occupied countries were to be interrogated and then shot without further ado. So it was a very risky business, but he accepted it. And General Eisenhower, looking forward to the D-Day plans, wanted about 300 specially trained men that could be dropped behind enemy lines in teams of 3 to try and galvanize the French resistance units after D-Day so that they could harass German reinforcements and blow up railway lines, bridges, this sort of thing. So they were to be 300 elite soldiers chosen for that, and Henry applied for that unit and was accepted due to his skills. The operation was called Operation Jedburgh, after the town in Scotland, and it was common to call people like Henry either Jedburghs or even Jeds. And Henry, as I say, was now battle-hardened, very, very tough, very resourceful, and they would take part in sabotage and trying to get the French resistance to harass the Germans. They were taught how to use captured German weapons, how to live off the land, how to capture or catch fish, animals, and so on, how to live behind enemy lines, basically, without any major recourse to Allied resources. They were taught unarmed combat by a chap who'd served in the Shanghai police force for 30 years and had fought the Chinese gangs there, a very tough bloke. And in August 1944, Henry was by then a major, and he was actually placed in charge of one of these 3-man teams, a Jedburgh team that was codenamed Andrew. And within the team, he had a Belgian officer, Edouard d'Outremont, who had actually been on the train with Henry at Lille when Fuller was interrogated by the Germans. Outremont was helping with the escape line activities. Next slide, please. Not a very good photo, I'm afraid. This is from the Jedburgh files. Henry is here. That can see really well. Outremont is here, and this is a chap called Harrison, Frank Harrison, who's the radio man. Both of these were officers. Harrison was a sergeant, but Henry was in command. And as I say, a very tough bunch. Every man was given a cyanide pill, just in case. D-Day came and went. Jedburgh teams were parachuted into France, but Henry's team, Team Andrew, their chance didn't come until the 15th of August, 1944. And they were flown across the channel from a secret base at Tempsford. He had with him D'Oultremont and Harrison, but also on the plane, there were 2 French officers and 8 Belgian Special Forces soldiers. They were going to perform other missions, right, in other parts of the Ardennes, it was. The plan was the aircraft would see the signal lights, if you like, of the Resistance Welcoming Committee in the Ardennes, and they would jump out at that point and then link up with the Resistance forces. The 8 Special Forces soldiers from Belgium, they jumped out, they vanished. Henry then couldn't see the lights anymore, they'd vanished as well. So the aircraft flew around a bit, did a couple of circles. They thought they saw a light, they weren't really sure. It could have been the Germans, but they decided to jump out anyway. So they jumped out, didn't really know where they were going, sort of thing. Landed in some very, very heavily wooded areas, couldn't find Harrison. Henry soon caught up with D'Oultremont on the ground. No sign of Harrison or his radio either. What were they to do? So Henry was in charge. He thought they would perhaps look for a farmhouse where probably the French people would be friendly and would give some support, you know, and then they could sort of reconsider their options. While they were sort of trying to find a farmhouse, they marched for quite a few hours, struggling to find anywhere. And then they heard some noises, and in fact, some of the canisters of supplies and ammunition and so on that had been dropped with them had been found by a couple of French lads, and the French lads were trying to break these open, making a lot of noise. The Frenchmen guided Henry and D'Oultremont to a farmhouse, and there they found Harrison, but no sign of his radio. The radio, in fact, turned up later in pieces. It never worked. Next slide. And Henry's mission now was to catch up with this chap, Jacques Paris de Bollardière, a former French Foreign Legion soldier. He's very famous in France, apparently. He got his own statue. And he was running a resistance group called the Citronelle Group, for 120 French resistance fighters. When Henry and his buddies met up with Bollardière, it was obvious that wires had been crossed between London and France, because Henry sort of said, well, here I am, I'm at your disposal. And Bollardière said, well, here I am, I'm at your disposal. So nobody knew quite what was going on. They thought it would be a good idea, as Henry's radio had vanished, perhaps Henry could use Bollardière's radio and get a message through to London to say, look, yes, we're with them, they need supplies, can you drop this, 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 and this, you know, a week next Tuesday, you know, click and collect sort of thing, and we'll do that. So a message was sent using the French resistance radio, and days and days and days and days went by, nothing happened. And then they had a message saying we can't decode the message because they were using a French resistance radio, which didn't have the Jedburgh secret codes. So the message lay in London for over a week. Nobody could figure out what it meant. They then sent the correct codes. They requested supply drops, and they never happened. All the time Henry was there, he was there a couple of weeks, nothing ever arrived. So that part of the mission was a failure. Not Henry's fault. London, I think, were dropping supplies nearer to the battlefronts, if you like, than the Ardennes was at that time. But there were plenty of Germans to fight in the Ardennes. So a few days after arrival, it turned out that a Belgian resistance force had attacked some Germans, and the German response had been particularly ferocious, and the Belgians had been routed and needed assistance. So this Bollardière chap, with Henry and about 80 men, set off for this attack site. And what they found was there were no resistance fighters there from Belgium, but there was a German truck and a few German soldiers there, plus some German female nurses. So Henry was sort of cautioning, you know, let's be careful, there are women there, sort of thing. But one of the resistance fighters opened fire anyway. The nurses all ducked and dived, and luckily none of them were injured. They peppered this German truck with bullets. The Germans fought back again. Henry's mob got to the truck, and they found several dead Germans inside it. But the fight then really petered out a bit. Went back to the camp in the middle of the forest, and the following day they thought, well, they had a number of camps spread around this area, sort of secret camps in a very dense forest area. They thought they'd shift camp now just to avoid any German activity, any German reprisals. But before they could pack up properly, the Germans in fact arrived and attacked the camp. And again, Henry, he wrote a report. He wrote, I think it's about a 15-page report on his time with the Jedburgh team in the Ardennes. And he does say that he had a very narrow field of fire, but he managed to shoot 3 Germans, one at a time, as they emerged from the woods. So obviously he was an experienced soldier, and he was doing what he had to do in wartime. The fight with the Germans then reached a stalemate. The resistance fighters then started drifting away to get away to safety. The Germans weren't too keen to pursue, and so on. And it probably left about 30 resistance fighters either killed, wounded, or missing. Even Bollardier had been wounded. He'd been wounded in the knee. He was practically carried. And they reached another camp, and then they got another message. Now the Germans now were in retreat in France. Another message to say that a nearby town had been liberated. And I think Bollardier thought he would enter like Napoleon now in a moment of glory and take all the accolades of the local population. Again, Henry cautioned a bit of, let's be careful with this now, we're not sure what's going on. But Bollardier was having none of it. So Henry, Bollardier, and a couple of Frenchmen jumped into a car, drove into this town at high speed, went to the house of the local resistance leader, who told them, you shouldn't have come, the Germans have come back. They're up the road, sort of thing. And at that point, as Henry looked out the window, 2 Germans on motorbikes just literally drove past the house. So it wasn't a very safe place to be for a man in uniform. Excuse me. So they sort of got back out of town. There was nothing to be done there. They did instead manage to visit a nearby village, which was actually free of Germans. And the colonel there received all the accolades he could expect from the crowd. They were really pleased to be free of the Germans after 3 years, sort of thing. And Henry knew that his time there was really over. So he cadged a lift. They met up with the American forces who were advancing. Henry cadged a lift back to Paris, reported to the SOE in London that the mission really had been a failure because supplies hadn't been forthcoming. Bollardier could have done a lot more. If he'd had more supplies, he could have recruited more men and so on. But as I say, that wasn't really Henry's fault. The French gave Henry a croix de guerre with palm. And there's this story, I came across this story in some sort of secondary material, which I didn't think it was true. But apparently, having helped the resistance, Henry was back in England. I'm not entirely sure whether this was 44 or 45, but he was certainly on leave in Norfolk when his car broke down. And an ATS vehicle came up alongside. Princess Elizabeth wasn't driving it, but she was in the vehicle. And she may have known of Henry because he'd had a military cross from the king. And Winifred, I think, is distantly related to royalty. I think Charles may know that. But anyway, fourth cousin. Okay. So Elizabeth realised that perhaps Henry was known to her parents, and in fact took him to Sandringham for tea with the king and queen. Now, I wasn't sure if this was true, whether it was sort of like one of these urban myths, but I wrote to the Paris in London, the archivist, and had a reply from Balmoral, from a lady in waiting, who said, yes, the Queen does remember Mr. Coombe-Tennant coming to Sandringham, but emphasised the Queen wasn't driving, she hadn't passed that test. So that was okay. So Henry then, now he's at the loose end again on leave, and another special unit is being formed of elite soldiers, and Henry volunteers for that as well. He obviously found something that really interested him. This was it was a short-lived body called the Special Allied Airborne Reconnaissance Force, bit of a mouthful, SAF for short. Another unit that would operate behind enemy lines. And the idea with this unit was, this was in 1945, and there was a real worry that places like Colditz Castle, as the Allied armies advanced, the Germans might simply kill their prisoners, especially VIP prisoners. And the idea was that people like Henry in 3-man teams would be dropped near these prisoner of war camps, and how they would do this, I have no idea. They would try and persuade the camp commandant not to massacre their captives, on the basis that, don't do this and we'll put a good word in for you, something. And Henry was penciled in to be dropped near Colditz with Patrick Lee Fermor. You may have heard of him. He's dead now. He's a very well-known travel writer, a polyglot. And in the war, Lee Fermor was actually an SOE agent. And on the island of Crete, he kidnapped the German commandant and got him off the island and over to Egypt. So a very, very resourceful chap, you know. And Henry was quite happy, you know, mixing in that sort of company, really, because of his elite soldier attributes. So this is called its castle. They say they were going to be dropped near there. They weren't sure how they would tackle it, but Lee Fermor heard that an officer who had been repatriated from Colditz was back in Britain, and this chap had got out by feigning sickness. He feigned sickness so well, the Germans just repatriated him because he'd be less trouble in London than in Colditz. So Paddy Lee Fermor went to see this chap and explained the Colditz plan to him, and the chap said, "It's not going to work. It'll be, you know, suicide. You can't do it." So that plan was on the point of falling through. Although Henry, as I say, was penciled in for it, when in fact the Americans, I think it was, reached Colditz and freed the prisoners without them coming to any harm. So when the war ended, Henry did say he spent a few days after the end of the war, as he puts it, swanning around Germany in a jeep, picking up SOE agents who had not been shot, luckily, but were in displaced persons camps. They're probably agents. The Germans hadn't quite figured out who they were, what they were, hadn't killed them, and the war was over, and Henry was identifying these people, he knew some of them personally, and getting them back to Britain. He also apparently helped free Jersey Islanders who had been taken to Germany as forced labor, and because of his French, he was able to communicate with them more easily and get them back to where they came from, sort of thing. After the war, the Welsh Guards in 1946 went off to Palestine to police the Mandate, trying to keep the Jews and the Arabs from killing each other. And Henry, again, he got bored there. He often got bored of things. He wangled himself a role on a mission to Saudi Arabia, a military mission where the British were training Saudi Arabian troops, you know, in military matters and techniques and so on. And Henry was the Deputy Assistant Quartermaster General, got an important role in making sure all the right supplies were in the right place at the right time. He got some leave, went into Jordan. He retraced some of the footsteps of Lawrence of Arabia, and he climbed this mountain in his spare time. This is the Jebel Rum mountain in Jordan, quite a high thing. And apparently he was the first non-Arab to climb that mountain. Now, how he did that, I've got no idea, because he'd only ever really been up Swiss mountains and come down on a pair of skis, but he did it. The mission in Saudi Arabia, like Palestine, was pretty grim. You know, Spartan terrain, blistering heat, and so on. Not a very good place to be at all. And when the Mandate ended in 1948, and our troops came back, the Arabs and the Jews immediately went to war with each other. But Henry by then was safely back in Britain. Next, please. The trooping of the colour in 1948 was going to be the first one since the war had been declared in 1939, where full ceremonial dress would be worn. And Henry was to command a 75-strong contingent of Welsh Guardsmen on the day. On the day before, it had rained. On the day of the parade, or the ceremony, it rained outside London. And the Major General commanding the ceremony decided he didn't want to get the bearskins wet and the uniforms wet and the equipment wet. So he cancelled the event. There were 250,000 people apparently lining in London, but he cancelled the event. And I think this is Henry and two comrades, Henry's in the middle, dressed up for the event, but it never took place. I think he may well have been there the next year, but I couldn't find his name in the press. Going back to the royal link, when the king died, King George VI died in 1952, Henry was one of the 4 Welsh Guardsmen who stood the vigil of the coffin. This is where it gets a bit hazy now, because Henry has started to move into the role of military intelligence on the next one, Steve. I know from the records he's left, which are a bit skimpy and a bit lacking in detail, he was certainly in Germany and Austria, West Germany and Austria, between 52 and 54. I know he was at Klagenfurt, some other places. And in 56, he was definitely at The Hague in Holland, and he was definitely in MI6. His secretary got in touch, but wouldn't tell me what they were up to, so I got no idea what he did there. He received a medal from the Dutch. He was made an officer of the Orange Order for his services to diplomacy. When his mother died in 1956, Winifred died in London, Henry, in fact, I think his interest was, he was still interested in psychic affairs. He contacted a psychic medium via a contact in the SPR, provided some information, generic sort of information, and a series of seances took place, which Henry didn't attend, but results are fed back to him. And you've got to say, the results that came back, Henry thought, and I think Alexander thought as well, some of them seem to have a grain of truth. Some of them seem to be as if almost Winifred was speaking, if you like, from beyond the grave. We make what we will of that. There's a book on that called Swan in a Black Sea by a lady called Gerald Cummins. Henry ended his MI6 career, which, as I say, is clouded in secrecy, as our man in Baghdad. He was in Baghdad in 1959. We lost that, have we? I think he's in many more slides. He was in Baghdad in 1959. In Baghdad in 58, there'd been a very bloody revolution. The royal family of Iraq had been butchered. A revolutionary government came in. The worry was that the new government might be very pally with the Russians. MI6 networks in 58 had probably been affected by the revolution. Probably some agents had been discovered, imprisoned, killed, whatever. So Henry probably went out there to try and rebuild those networks. And also, as a trained soldier, to try and see what sort of influence the Russians were having on the Iraqi army, what sort of equipment were they providing them with, how effective a fighting force were they, and so on. And I think he'd be trying to counter Russian influence in Iraq, trying to make the new Iraqi revolutionary government a bit more favourable towards London, because again, we were very reliant on Iraq for oil and so on. But it's all, we're not really sure, and we can't find out, and so on. But he does say in his writings, in 1965, he did write, he gave a lecture to WI, I think, near here somewhere. And in his notes for the lecture, which are up downside, he does say that in 59, the year after the revolution, he went to Iraq, and something happened there to him that had a profound effect on him, and he underwent physical and psychological suffering. I know what that means. I don't think Charles knows. Mark and John don't know. I just wonder, was he captured or detained by the Iraqi secret police? Were the Russians involved in something? But physical suffering. This isn't like a nervous breakdown, is it, or a psychological problem? He has suffered physically. So I think somebody has inflicted physical harm, and I can only assume that's to do with his work with the special services. So he turned to religion, as I say, and he took some advice from the I think it's the rector of the Jesuit college in Baghdad, who was an American, and he was basically, I think, received into the church there. He did a bit of reading, so he chose the Catholic faith as his preferred choice. Next one, see. Here he is, if you remember him. And he took some advice as well from the Archbishop of Liverpool, Derek Warlock. And it was Derek Warlock, apparently, who suggested that Henry might like to try Downside Abbey. Now, there are people here today, I think, who know more about Dom Joseph than I do, as far as his time at the Abbey is concerned. But he did describe it in his writings as being a sort of experience of having your head in the clouds and your feet firmly planted on the ground. He didn't like teaching in the school, apparently. But several pupils have written to me saying how much they liked him and admired him and so on. He did say that he didn't really think he was cut out for parish work, but in fact, he found, I think, that when he actually tried it, he didn't actually mind it. And he made the comment that he had to do a lot of listening to his parishioners, and he only occasionally having to offer guidance. He found that quite rewarding. And what of the plan that Winifred believed would see Henry become the new Messiah? I don't think Henry really knew much about that as a young man. He may have known in the 1940s about it, but he was in the army. He was busy after his neck in fighting and whatever. I don't think it had any real marked effect on Henry's thoughts, thinking, or outlook. In the local archive office, I must have looked at over 200 files about Henry that Winifred carefully kept. Some of them were 3 pages. Some of them were musical compositions. Some of them were in Chinese. I didn't bother with those, to be honest. One of them contained his milk teeth. But there was never a mention in any of Henry's correspondence with his mother and his brothers and other people of the plan, right? So, you know, as I say, I think it had no real impact on Henry at all. Jean Balfour, I mentioned earlier, she had said that, you know, although Henry was a remarkably good-looking young man, had a presence, you know, and very, very intelligent, she thinks, you know, he was very interested in things. He was interested in himself. He liked, you know, philosophy, the upper academic things, if you like, you know, as well as being a practical soldier. And he didn't really have or need to have, I think, the drive to make the plan come to fruition. So if it was a plan with any chance of success, I suspect it fizzled out because Henry did nothing himself to push it. So he arrived at Downside at the start of the 60s. Next slide, please. This is an image sent to me by Rosalie, one of Henry's niece, actually. Here he is as an older man in a family setting. he was very active with chess. He set chess puzzles, and you see these ones in the newspapers, solve this in 3 moves or less, sort of thing. And he's looking apparently at a puzzle on his travel chess set. So very, very keen on chess. But he was at Downside in the 60s, ordained in 66, Bradstock in 69, and in Little Malvern in 73. As you may know, by the 80s. He was suffering from mobility problems, hip problems on both hips. And he had an operation which was successful for one hip. But heart problems, I think, had been revealed at some point, and they thought another operation would be a bit of a risk. So he died at Downside on the 6th of November, 1989. Next slide, please. This is what Abbot John Roberts said at the graveside. You can read that, yeah. Yeah, and that concludes my talk.
Thank you, Bernard.